So I'd like to share some insights about the nature of an internal part of self that often comes up for some clients. Sometimes it's called the inner critic, or the accuser, if you want to get into more of a theological basis. But and then some individuals they sort of fully embody this part of self, especially people that have narcissistic personality disorder. But I'd like to speak more in terms of, say, borderline or avoidant or some other personality disorders where there really is a fully active mimic. That's a term from ego state therapy. A part of self that sort of mimics the messaging, usually from a narcissistic parent or culture, or wherever the message may be from. It can certainly be from an abusive spouse or ex-spouse, but in most cases, when it's gotten to the level of this kind of Jekyll and Hyde, this internal abusive relationship, we're probably looking at some very early attachment disturbances with, say, a narcissistic mother, or that may even just be from a religious or cultural institution that unrelentingly portrays the values associated with that. So one of the main tasks in maturation is known as the Oedipal resolution. Another term that seems to play into that is called reproachment. So there's a stage in life where self and other aren't really that differentiated. The infant doesn't really know that most of the power that he or she receives in terms of the capacity to do all of these great things that they can feel proud of is really because there's adults sort of footing the bill. And they have this sense of omnipotent egocentricity, and as much as that sounds like maybe not really the qualities that we want to see in our fellow adults, it's perfectly natural if you're a toddler, and maybe even a sign that some things went well. There's pride. There's sort of a healthy grandiosity that that shows there's they're sort of claiming their little place in the world, but not quite in relationship to others. So that's where the next step comes in. And this step is one that needs to be sort of carefully navigated, because although it's really nice to feel that, the little toddler has, this strength and this capacity and this confidence. And those are even maybe the roots of some impulses later on that would turn into ambition and charisma. And maybe some qualities aren't so bad. Maybe some really valuable personality traits, to bring into the relationship with the world. But the necessary hurdle then is to look at weaknesses, immaturities, things that might make the individual, like toddler or adult, going through this sort of dilemma later on in life, that might make them feel shame or embarrassed, mortified, humiliated, even to the extent of feeling unlovable. And that's really kind of the pivot here. So how does one learn that this kind of temper tantrum, egocentric attitude really probably won't really make the people in the world around want to fulfill your needs, if those needs happen to be for validation and mirroring and this kind of seeing the special thing about you, that's less likely to happen if you're throwing a hissy fit because you got a bad grade on your little assignment. In fact, you're probably going to get another check mark around behavior and discipline and cooperativeness and all those other things that are important to to getting along with others and really feeling a little bit more grown up. So, shame. Shame is natural. Shame is necessary. Shame can even give way to humility. And that's really the nature of sort of the edible resolution. I can't get and claim this adult that I've been fused with in the way that this other adult can have a relationship with that person. It's usually a mother. And not to say that anyone who doesn't have a two-parent household is somehow not capable of having an edible resolution, but generally the terms that we talk about and the terms that are helpful to consider when doing therapeutic work with these as parts of the self is the attitude of this sort of critic, this reactive mimic, whatever you want to call it, this part of self that's very upset about the therapeutic process in general. Well, this part is then having to have a relationship with the more mature adult parts of self that really see it as problematic, in its commentary. Sometimes the commentary is actually pretty vile. And then whenever there's a discussion of this, that shame that might be ideally experienced by this very reactive part is then projected, as it would be in the real world if you're really confronting a narcissistic, personality disordered individual about their behavior. The shame would then be projected. It would be projected onto the accuser, or in some cases more likely onto the recipients of their abuse. So this is where shame gets tricky, right? Because if we're dealing with the level of personality organization called the narcissistic structure, an individual's fully identified with their, little monster, their egocentric, false self that seeks this type of grandiosity, this specialness, this looking down on anyone who might see them as being, emotionally immature. That is capable of overcoming the horrendous sense that, nobody's going to love you if you act like that. And the people who do, well, they're probably brainwashed. They probably have a little version of this going on inside of themselves, coercing them to feeling terrible about themselves if they're not meeting the expectations of the external narcissist. So bringing it back to the individual that's not at that level of identification with the false self. That's a very stable way to live. Because if you can just project anything and create conflict wherever you go, and then other people react, then obviously you can just project onto them for acting in a way that doesn't match your sort of unilaterally decided upon right way of being in the world, which is based on who you are. That's a very stable, unfortunate way to be. But for the individuals that don't have that seamless identification with the grandiose false self, and perhaps that's a term better really fully described elsewhere. I actually just wrote a piece in my blog, An Oasis in the Desert, that addresses somewhat the notion of the false self. But it's essentially what we're talking about here. For the individual in the borderline state, where there's an inner fragmentation, where the primary identification is the self that's experiencing the abuse of the narcissistic abusive self-object, or that's come to develop sort of a relationship with the external world that has certain expectations that are also highly egocentric, but kind of being egged on by this internal voice. It's unfortunate that the behaviors from many of these individuals that are in the borderline spectrum the behaviors that they display to really try and meet certain desperate needs for acceptance and validation and love. The ways in which those are gone about are often likely to ultimately result in the opposite. So, again, there needs to be a bit of a hostage situation to even just have somebody there patient enough to put up with it. Or in the contrary, there's a relationship with an active, abusive, traumatizing narcissist. And so, here's the loving relationship between someone who has an internalized abuser in a relationship with a fully realized abuser. And, they can kind of abuse one another and not be alone. Clearly, one person's probably a little bit more privileged in that interaction than the other, but frankly, it's a miserable mix. Again, coming back to the notion of the reactive mimic and the borderline, that reactive mimic is sometimes very difficult to cajole into somehow aligning with the therapeutic task. Obviously, the therapeutic task is what they are the most opposed to. I think of it as sort of like being an orphan, an orphan in one of these poor cities that doesn't quite have much of a social net. And all that can be done is join some sort of a gang and steal and hurt. And there's much less likelihood that they'd ever even be accepted into that city. And let's say that the response of the city is to attack them, to incarcerate them, to demonize them. Well, they're just going to turn more against it, aren't they? And then when there's an opening for some kind of the receipt of the prodigal son, this type of, you're welcome to be assisted in growing up, but the rules are going to be determined by the more mature adult self now. No matter what this critic says, how it deflects shame towards hurt parts of self, no matter how it tries to drum up any defense imaginable in order to lose its foothold of control, and securing at least grandiosity and at least this sort of prideful arrogance that turns against the therapeutic agenda. Ultimately, if the individual is persistent enough in their efforts, more and more of the psychology of that individual is going to be colonized by the adult parts. And it's very unpleasant to have a war like this within oneself. And so even though the romantic partner of the adult who's harboring a reactive mimic or an inner critic may not really know or really be able to or expected to fully love that critic and their partner. The partner of the reactive borderline may really feel some compassion at best, but this is an individual that's also probably been held hostage or abused passive-aggressively by the always discontent, selfish, and sort of emotionally stunted, reactive mimic. So the alternative is to sort of recognize the reactive mimic did not become this way, for any reason that was under its control. And in fact, it's the victim of conditioning and abuse. It's kind of like a child that's taken away from its sort of native culture and then forced into a colonial, abusive environment, which is, highly dogmatic and religious and sort of disgustingly unhealthy in its messaging. And then the child is released back to the world and There may need to be a bit of some patience there, and allowing the rapprochement to finally take place with the most adult parts of the self that are very much involved in the therapeutic process. It often requires really recognizing when that voice, one might even say it's the individual's mother's voice or their father's voice. Really, it began there. Those were the colonizers, but it's become the voice of the reactive mimic in the self. And ultimately, that voice just isn't going to win in a properly structured internal family system. It's just not going to win. And even though so much damage has been done, so much suffering has been endured over the years by the individual who is so divided, on account of the malicious activity of this part of self, ultimately healing requires a rapprochement that's two-sided. So this is a delicate process, and I think it needs to be accomplished in concert with perhaps the right therapist. But it really is primarily a rapprochement that takes place within. And it takes time. Back to the analogy of the orphan child, they could very well choose to be on the run, committing arson, saying hateful things, and really considering themselves to be an outcast. And not only that, but a righteous outcast. But there's a home. There's a home where individuals are patient. And it's that stepping down and that humbling process that's an epic task. And the child would not be received with shame, although shame is a necessary emotion in response to all the abuses towards the self and vicarious others that were affected by this. But there's not a shaming, there's not a really holding it against them with a grudge by the most mature caregiving parts of the self. And it may be a journey of helping this child actually go through the reconciliation of its grievances with the world. And that can be a long process. But there is time. If one makes it this far, there should be time for that to take place as well. So this is a fairly in-depth look at a very specific therapeutic process taking place with individuals that have very active internal critics, especially something to look out for with borderline or avoidant personality disorder individuals. And really borderline also tends to mean sort of part of a spectrum, in terms of personality functioning. Like I say, it's qualitatively different from the pure narcissistic characterological functioning where the individual is fully aligned with this. And finally, maybe one last note. There's a privilege to living in a world as an adult with other adults who can be supportive, caring, mature. And that is a world that both these internal parts, but also other people, perhaps some people watching this video, might find that they belong to. A world that really is based in sort of a self-centered agenda for allowing this attitude to prevail. Attitudes of, racism, misogyny, homophobia, really just high-level neuroticism that's deeply egocentric and antagonistic to any more mature or perhaps likewise immature reactive stances that would call them out. And just like dealing with privilege in other parts of life, you want to make sure not to get mugged. It's important for the more mature parts of self, or the individuals that aren't aligned with narcissistic institutions or cultures, personalities, to find a way of holding some ground and holding some boundaries, and recognizing that there is an emotional, cultural difference in the choices of relating to other people as whole objects, rather than as sources of narcissistic projection or fuel. As a psychotherapist, it's clear that I align with whole person to whole person relationships as a preferable orientation to humanity and to this life, specifically in intimate relationships. But in just deriding and devaluing and insulting those who are currently confined to a world of egocentric antagonism. Ideally, there's a bit of tact and recognition that is a very disadvantaged emotional situation. And we have to deal with it on, I wouldn't necessarily say on its own terms, but with a mindfulness to what will be accepted and then what is provoking to that. Generally, the best advice is to keep it light and not get too personal, and try not to poke at it with a stick. Maybe stay off certain threads on Facebook for a start. So that should conclude the video today. Seemed to be pretty dense and abstract, but believe me, this is very practical material for a certain stage in the therapeutic process, and I think it might also be educational for most of us who are interested in psychology, to consider how this dynamic struggle takes place in many individuals. Thanks.